Hey everyone! Today we're going to take you and your class on a virtual field trip through the forest. We're going to see all kinds of cool things and we're going to learn about them too. We're going to stop along the way and tell you about maple trees, sap, syrup, and how delicious maple syrup is made. So, if you're ready, grab your hat and your mitts. It's kind of cold today. Let's go! Today we are at the Oshman Forest in the township of North Dundas, the location of our flagship maple syrup education program. The Oshman Forest was owned by the Oshman family, who live right next door to this day for many years. The Oshman family used this forest to produce maple syrup. The old sugar shack they used is still visible from the trail. Keep an eye out, we will see it today on our tour. In 2017, the Oshman family donated this forest to South Nation Conservation in memory of Gertrude Oshman. We are proud to manage and maintain this forest for the production of maple syrup, as well as maintain it for outdoor education and recreation. Today, we're going to bring you and your class on a virtual field trip through the forest, and we're going to learn and see lots of interesting things. Along the tour, we're going to stop and discuss and learn all about maple syrup, sap, forests, animals, and more. I hope you're ready. Let's go!
This forest is rich with plant life, especially coniferous and deciduous trees. Deciduous trees, such as the sugar maple, this leaf here, lose their leaves in the fall, while coniferous trees, like the eastern white pine, retain their needles and grow pine cones. Deciduous trees often produce food, such as maple syrup, nuts, and fruits. Coniferous trees often contribute to wood building materials and help to make paper. Both types of trees are important to a healthy forest and the environment. Did you know that we have one species of tree that's considered a deciduous conifer? This type of tree is called a larch. Biodiversity is important in a maple forest. Many other species use this forest. Can you guess which species? Some of those would be deer, squirrel, raccoons, and birds.
Did you know that conifer is conifère in French and deciduous is décidu in French?
All trees produce sap, but the best trees for the sweetest maple syrup is the red maple, black maple, and sugar maple. All three of these trees exist in the Oshman Forest here. There is over 10 different maple trees in Canada, and they include the sugar, the black, the red, the silver, the big leaf, the mountain, striped, Douglas, vine, and Manitoba maple.
Sugar maple in French is érable à sucre.
So, now that we've learned how to identify maple trees by their leaves, how do we know how to identify a maple tree when there's no leaves? I'm going to help you out. Maple trees can be identified because they have a specific formation to them. So if we take a look here, we can see that this branch has a Y formation, like the letter Y. And maple trees will have this, and in the forestry term, we call that opposite branching. So that is when the branches come off the trunk at the same spot on both sides, like that. And you and your class might try this at your desks. If you get up with your teacher and everybody stands up straight and then put your hands out to the side like that, we can be an example of a maple tree in the winter without leaves. So here I've got the branch, the trunk of my tree, and my two arms as the branches coming out at the same spot, both sides. What about you try it now? But one of the easiest ways that I like to be sure I'm looking at a maple tree is to look for trees that have sap buckets hanging from them or pipelines attached to them, like the blue ones we're seeing today in this field trip. But don't be fooled. Even if a tree does not have a pipeline or a sap bucket on it, it might still be a maple.
Branch in French is branche.
Have you ever seen a dead or a fallen tree on the forest floor? Have you ever gone and taken a really close look at it? These trees are crawling with life. They're full of bacteria, fungus, and small insects. These fallen trees provide really important nutrients to the forest floor and to the wildlife that live here. As a conservation authority, we practice conservation efforts as part of everything we do. We are a part of nature and not separate from it. By encouraging diversity in this maple forest, we are strengthening the overall environment by maintaining an environment suitable for all living things as well as humans. Almost everything you see, hear, or smell in this forest is connected to something else in some way. A great example are birds. Birds are great caretakers of trees as they often manage insects that might be harmful to the maple trees.
Hey guys, I just saw something really cool. Let's check it out. Take a look at this tree. Can you see all the holes all the way up and down? There's big ones, there's small ones, and there's really tiny ones if you look really closely. Those holes are created by birds, probably woodpeckers. These trees are dead standing trees. We also refer to them as a snag. Trees like this one, who are dead but still standing, add so much value to forests like the one that we're in. We need diversity from all kinds of animals to make sure that this forest works as best that it can. We already heard today about the importance of birds in a forest, and this is a great example of keeping habitat or places to live for those types of birds in a maple forest. Every animal has its place here.
Did you know that squirrels love the maple sap? They often go to the pipelines that are in the forest and will suck out of them like a straw. This causes a lot of problems when there's holes in the pipelines, because then you have to go through the forest and fix all of these holes. Have you ever tried drinking through a straw that has holes in it? It's not very easy.
Squirrel in French is écureuil. Depending on your type of forest, you have to cut some trees. Not all the trees, but some. Sometimes trees get older and they eventually die, but sometimes you can take those trees out and use the product. So sometimes the wood you can either cut up in planks to do different projects like build a table or a cupboard and stuff like that, but you can also use it as firewood, so to heat your house. So depending on what you need from your forest and the stage of your forest, you can cut some trees to use for different things. One thing that is really important is to keep the small trees in there. So if you do not keep young trees or the small trees, as you can probably see around, there are a lot of small trees. If you don't keep those, well, eventually the older trees will become too old to produce sap and they will eventually die. And you need those small trees to take the place of the older trees. It's the same with you guys. So you guys are kids that will eventually take the place of the adults, and if there's no kids, then there is no more adults in the future. The same with trees. If you don't have the small trees, then eventually you won't have all the older trees. And it is really important to have lots of small trees because sometimes trees get sick, and so if you have many small trees, well, you have a good chance that a good amount of them will survive and take the place of your older trees. So remember when I was talking about those small maples that we want to keep to have a future sugar bush? Well, this with the blue marking is those maples that we want to keep. So we have identified all over the bush the good maples that we want to protect for the future. So this is too small to tap now, but in a few years it's going to grow and it's going to be big enough so we can put a tap in and it's going to produce sap so we can make our syrup. Have you seen how straight and beautiful it is?
When we look at the forest, we always ask, even myself, I look at it and say, is this a healthy forest? And when I ask kids this, they look around and they say, oh, yeah, it is. It's a beautiful forest. And I tell them, no, it's not. It's a hot dog forest. And they look at me strange. What are you talking about, a hot dog forest? And I said, well, do you know what a hot dog is made of? No. And I said, well, you'll have to ask your parents what's it made of. It's made of noses and beaks and butts and toes and everything else that they can't sell your mom and dad as meat. Goes to the hot dog factory. And voila, it gets processed and cooked and pounded and crushed and packed into a little tube and comes out. It's cooked. It's a hot dog. And as long as you don't think about it, they taste really good. But when we look at the forest, what's happened over the last, since Europeans came, is we high grade the forest. What's that mean, high grade? It means we take the best and leave the rest. Nobody wants to buy a jacket with a broken zipper. You're not going to pay good money for that. It's the same when we came to timbers. We only wanted the best timbers, so we cut the best timbers and we left the unhealthy stuff there. The problem with doing that for a few hundred years is you remove all that great genetic material that produced that healthy forest, produced those high quality trees and plants. So you're left with the stuff nobody wants, the hot dog forest. And what do we do today with this hot dog forest? Now we go through, we take out the worst trees, like the invasive species ones that are infected, the ones that have poor shape or broken. Those are the trees we remove. We try and find the new young trees that are coming up that are healthy, straight, and we groom them to become a nice, straight, healthy tree. So now it's just the opposite. We take the worst, and hopefully we end up with the best.
This is an ash tree, and the problem we have with ash trees in our area is that there's this insect, a little bug, that's called the emerald ash borer. And what it does, it basically kills our beautiful ash trees.
So the emerald ash borer got here through untreated wood from China. It's a native species in China, but it has its own little critters that feast on it and keep it in check and level.
Because it's not from here, it does not have a predator. So that means there's nothing in our forest or in our nature that can eat that little bug and control it.
Now it's been here for 10, 15 years. Birds are realizing, other things are realizing, oh, we can eat these things. And now they're starting to prey on them. But the problem is, southern Ontario and most of the United States, south or northeastern United States, has been hit so bad with the emerald ash borer that they're all dying. All the ash trees are dying. It doesn't matter what the species, it just goes through and it kills them all. Those are bugs. We have all kinds. We have all kinds of plants that come through. You don't see it so much here, but if we were to go a little further over into the woodlot, we have a species called buckthorn. And buckthorn just outcompetes everything. And it gets so bad that when I come in here to do the inventory work, I couldn't even see the tops of the trees. It was so thick with buckthorn. And what happens is nothing else grows underneath. So the trees continue to grow, but as they get old and weak, nothing will regenerate underneath because of the buckthorn. And again, that was brought in. It was brought in because Europeans thought this was something that we could utilize here. It was great for birds. They use it in Europe all the time. But again, there was nothing here to keep it in check, so it just took off like crazy. And now Ontario, North America, is now infested with that. We don't always think of the consequence until after. And that's where you have to stop and think before we do things. Before we take our garden junk that we don't want in our garden anymore and we throw it out in the edge of the bush, don't do that anymore, because that's how they get started. So invasive species are very, very important to think about when you're looking at ecology of an ecosystem and understanding that.
Sap is a fluid that transfers water and nutrients to the tree. So it starts at the roots, goes up right to the crown of the tree, and then back down. So when we tap the tree, and our pails have a lid to keep out debris and dirt, and also squirrels, which are plentiful in this forest. So we either use the bucket method or, as you can see here, the pipeline method. So to get the sap running, it has to be cool at night at -4 degrees and warmer in the day at +4 degrees. And that makes the sap flow down the pipelines. So you can just see it in the bubbles there.
So whenever we're going out to ensure or start tapping the bush, what we want to do is ensure that we're doing it in a sustainable level. And to do this, we actually measure each of the maple tree and determine the number of taps that are able, that tree is able to support. So we go by conservative tapping guidelines, which allow 1 tap if the tree is between 25 and 37 centimeters. Above that, 37 to 50 centimeters, we're able to put 2 taps on it. And if the tree is over 50 centimeters at the diameter breast height, then we're able to put 3 taps on it. So what we do is we go up and we use a set of calipers. So this measures the diameter of the tree. This one is 34 centimeters. So this is a hard maple, 34 centimeters. So we would be able to put 1 tap in this tree. And eventually, whenever this tree grows and exceeds that 37 centimeter diameter, we would be able to include another tap on that tree. So when going up to a tree to tap it, what you want to do is take a look around the entire tree and see if there's any defects on the tree. Primarily down below, what you're looking for is if there's any holes or anything like that. You don't want to tap above that hole, because what happens is that the sap is actually flowing up through the tree, and what you want is a nice clear section of tree that is relatively healthy, that's going to allow for really great sap transfer and transport up the trunk. So whenever you go, you want to select the right size drill bit, and you can have, we do 2 different things. We can use buckets for collection, or the more commercial operations now go to a pipeline through the bush. So what we want to do is look for a nice clear portion of the tree. You want to drill in at a slight angle upwards, and it's one stroke in and out to ensure that all the sawdust comes out. You want to go about 1.5 inches in, and then slightly and gently tap the spile in until it's snug, and then you can hang your bucket. So you have a hammer, and what you can do is just slightly tap until it becomes snug, and then hang your bucket. Now it's good practice to put a lid on your bucket, and that will ensure that no rain gets in there, animals can't get in, dirt or anything falling in there, because you want to keep your sap nice and clean. So in a couple hours, it's going to be a nice day today. I think it's supposed to get up to 10 degrees. It was below freezing last night, so this tree should start to run in the next couple hours whenever the sun starts to warm it up. And eventually this bucket will probably be full at the end of the day. So this is a pipeline system. So we have 508 taps here at the Oshman Forest. And essentially what this does is allows us to collect the sap from each of the trees in a relatively easy manner. So what we have down at the very bottom end of the property is a pump house, which houses a large storage tank as well as the vacuum pump. Now, in order for this vacuum system to work, it has to be a complete seal. So if you imagine sucking through a straw, you're able to suck up all of that sap or soda or whatever you're drinking with the straw until it's empty, and then all of a sudden you can't get any more. But if you put your hand on the end of the straw, you're able to essentially create vacuum, and that's essentially what we have here. So what this main line is what carries the vacuum or the air and the smaller line is what leads to each of the maple trees. And then we have taps that connect into this. So what happens is you turn the vacuum pump on, it starts pulling air through this big tube, and eventually all of this sap that is in the little lines charges up and essentially creates vacuum in these little lines. The sap runs along here and then drops down into the big tube, and then that vacuum or the suction of air pulls this, and it's all sloped downhill towards the sugar shack. And what it does is collects all the sap and then puts it into a large storage container. So at the end of the tapping season, it's important to essentially remove all the taps from the trees. And what you have to do is actually run a disinfectant through the line. And that's what keeps or inhibits mold from growing or any other type of bacteria from growing in the lines. So essentially what we do at the end of the season is we come up to the maple trees, we run the vacuum pump, and we start at the very far end of the bush. We come along and we actually pull each of the spiles out of the tree. We have a backpack full of isopropyl alcohol, and what we do is actually run isopropyl through the lines, and that essentially cleans the lines out and allows it to essentially be disinfected throughout the summer, and it inhibits any type of mold growth. If we were just to leave sap in the lines, it would turn almost hard. It would get all gunky and essentially create like a really thick film, which in the future would impact the efficiency of the vacuum system itself. So it's really important that that happens. And as soon as you pull the spile, you put it into this, which is a spile holder, and that's what keeps it nice and closed system, so that no bugs can get in, no wasps are going to make nests in there, and that sort of thing. So once the sap is actually harvested from the tree itself, it's essentially usable right away. You can drink the sap itself as a replacement for water if you would wish. But aside from that, there's just a wide plethora of stuff that you can make from maple sap. Obviously syrup, but then syrup can also be transformed into many different usable forms. You can make anything from candy floss right down to maple sugar treats, maple butter, maple sugar, and a lot of even right down into barbecue sauce and stuff like that.
Sap in French is sève.
This property was owned by the Oshman family. They immigrated here from Germany in the 1950s and purchased this farm here in Ormond, Ontario. This was an original woodlot. They were dairy farmers, but always had a heart for the forest and always just wanted to preserve it. In the 1970s, George built this sugar shack that's here on site. With the help of his family and friends, they milled all the wood from the property and erected the sugar shack, like I said, in the 1970s, and used it up until the mid-2000s. In the late 2000s, George's wife passed away, and it was his desire to pass this woodlot on in memory of his wife, but also so that it wouldn't be cut down, and that future families and generations would be able to utilize this woodlot for the beauty that it contains. In 2016, George donated the properties to South Nation. It's an 18-acre woodlot that features upland hardwoods, and currently S&C utilizes it as a day-use conservation area. So there's a 1.3 kilometer walking trail here, but also it's the home of the maple syrup education program.
The First Nations were the first to discover maple syrup. Wokus, a First Nations chief, and his wife made supper one night with maple sap, thinking that it was water. What a sweet surprise. One day in early spring, Wokus, a First Nations chief, came home from a day of hunting and threw his tomahawk into the trunk of the trees outside of his house, as he did every night. The next morning, Wokus woke and left for another hunt, pulling his tomahawk from the maple tree. It just so happened that his wife had placed a birch bucket at the base of the tree so Wokus would not forget to go fetch water. The bucket was directly under the gash made by Wokus's tomahawk. While Wokus was gone hunting, the warm spring sun shone on the maple tree and sap began to run from the gash, down the trunk, and dripped right into the bucket. As evening approached, Wokus's wife began to prepare dinner. She needed a pail of water to boil dinner in. As she walked past the tree on her way down to the creek, she noticed the bucket was full of water. Rather than walk all the way to the creek, Wokus's wife decided to use this water. As the dinner boiled, the water boiled away, and by the time dinner was done, the water, which was actually maple sap, had boiled down, creating the first maple syrup. Both Wokus and his wife were pleasantly surprised with the sweetness of this water. With a little experimenting, Wokus and his wife discovered how and when to make this all-natural sweetener. From that point on, maple syrup became an important part of the First Nations people's diet. Anytime you enjoy the sweet taste of maple syrup, take a second to thank our First Nations.
The origin is from North America, from First Nations, and it was the only country for the longest time that maple syrup was produced in. It was done nowhere else in the world, so it's truly a Canadian heritage of ours. It was originating here. It's now being made in many other countries, but it starts here, just like hockey and lacrosse and baseball. So at First Nations, when they first learned about doing this and using it, they weren't really using it for sugar content for maple syrup. What we were doing is we were using it as medicine. The maple tree is the first one of the season that starts to absorb nutrients and water in the springtime, which passes through the fine root hairs of the trees. And as it's passing through those root hairs, the starch that was made during the photosynthesis with all the sugar last summer, is stored in those fine roots. So right now, as it's thawing out around that tree, the water is going down right there around the base of the tree, and it's allowing those roots to start drawing up that water. And all the water is sucked up through the starch, converted back into a sugar, just to feed the buds, which are the very tips of the twigs. It's just to feed those. Once those buds pop open, the tree no longer needs that sap, so it flushes it all out. So that's why we have such a short window for doing this. But the first medicine is the sap itself. People didn't realize it, and even still today, during the winter time, we can't produce vitamin D through our skin with the sun. So First Nations knew that by drinking the sap, it's the only natural form we could get of vitamin D to detoxify ourselves. Can you imagine having to cook sap in this? This is the way we would have done it. Basswood log, hollowed out. It was probably much larger than this one, but it would be hollowed out. The sap would be collected at the base through birch buckets, dumped into the trough. Once the trough was about half full, we would have a fire going with the igneous rocks that are formed with fire that can hold the heat without exploding. It's very important to have those, because if you take the wrong type of rock, what happens is it explodes and you've got dirt and stones and everything else mixed into your sugar, which isn't what you want. So we would heat the fire, the rocks would heat up, and the rocks can hold 10 times the amount of energy the fire produces over time. So it's hot, yes, if you put your hand in there it'll burn, but if you put your hand on one of those rocks, you'll cook your fingers. So that's really important to know how hot they are. So once we'd pick the rocks would be heated, we would roll them across evergreen branches, usually hemlock or white pine, so that it would take the ash off, and from there we'd take the antlers or a fork stick, scoop them up, place them back into the trough, and it would be an instant boil. That's how hot the rocks are. And it would boil for 10 minutes each rock. And we would put something like this, we would probably have 7 to 10 rocks in here, all about the size, I like to say the size of a baby's skull, because that's about the size of the rocks we would use. And they would boil for 10 minutes. So that's a good hard boil. It would be like an evaporator going for an hour. That's how fast the rocks work. And this wasn't done just by one family. This is the time of year that we as Anishinaabes or Algonquins, we would be trappers. And this at the end of the season is right now for trapping. So we would be coming back together from our small family groups back into a large group. And we would settle out as like extended families into areas like this. where we would start to harvest just the sugar because it was so vital for us. The sap as well. It's that time for us all to detoxify. The sap is loaded with things like vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin B, vitamin B12, vitamin B7, vitamin B9. And if you look at chemistry, when you add heat to any elements like that, it changes its structure. And that's what happens when you boil it down. When you start to boil it and add that heat energy, all of a sudden that equation changes and it starts to change those molecules of vitamin A, vitamin B, vitamin C, all these different vitamins and minerals. It changes their structure. They start to collect together. And when you keep boiling it, that's what comes out as that gritty feeling you get that's called niter right now. That's what that is. All those things are being collected together, they're reforming, reshaping, and they're extracted out. So that's why when you take vitamin sap, or not vitamin sap, maple sap or maple sugar, that's why you don't get that same nutrient you would get if you were drinking the sap itself. So those are the things that you have to remember in chemistry. Those things were already understood by us, but all the knowledge has been brought along from the First Nations to Europeans. They brought cast iron, wonderful thing. The only thing is cast iron gets very hot very quickly, and sugar especially burns at a very low temperature. So the cast iron gets too hot, it starts to burn that. So they went from a one kettle system to a multi-kettle system, and they realized by dumping they start off with a big batch of sap, they would pour it into a smaller pot, they would put fresh sap in there to cool that bucket down, that big cast iron pot down. It would cool it down so it would stop the burning process. The next one, they would be a little bit higher up off the fire. It's already less water, it's thicker, it's starting to boil faster. We don't have to have it quite so close. And as we'd go along, they would go as far as sometimes 12 containers. They would start with a large one like this that might hold 35 gallons, and go to one that's 2 quarts. And that 2 quart would be almost their finished stock. From there, they would take it in and finish it off on their wood stoves or their fires, much easier to control. And that technology, they went to what's called a flat pan. As we started to separate out of our communities and started growing up in the farm sections and everybody was having their own woodlots, they moved from the technology. It's still used today, the pots. People still do this. But there's much faster technology that they know of. And a flat pan is what they would use. And it's about 4 feet by 4 feet and about 12 inches high. You would place it on a little bit of a slope so that the sap is shallow at one side and deeper at the other side. And the reason you want to do that, because where it's less thick of water, it will boil faster. So you would build your fire under that section. The rest of it would heat too, but it would be much slower. And as the water is evaporating, the thicker the content of sugar content, it would automatically slide down in that slope to the lowest point. It would still continue to boil. It would still lessen water, but it would boil much faster when you put the heat there. From that, they went right to a modern day evaporator.
Syrup in French is sirop. Tree in French is arbre.
Who knows what comes out of the kettle? It's steam. So when you boil the kettle, you can actually boil the water right away and it evaporates or disappears. So it's the same process with sap. We boil the sap until it makes syrup. It takes 40 liters of sap to make 1 liter of syrup. So think about a carton of milk. That's a liter and we need 40 of those. So the next time that you pour syrup over your pancakes, you can thank the forest that gave us this delicious treat. In Canada, we are the top producers of maple syrup.
Boil in French is bouillir.
Have you guys ever noticed trees like this in the wintertime who still have some of their leaves on them? It's a little bit confusing, right? These are what we call beech trees. I can always remember that it's a beech tree because the leaves that stay on the tree are like the color of sand, just like on a beach. But don't be fooled, these trees are called beech, spelled B-E-E-C-H, not beach, B-E-A-C-H, like the hot beach that we all wish we were on right now. These are beech trees, and they provide a source of food for all kinds of animals here. They produce a nut, and they're easy to recognize by their leaves that hang on all the way through the winter. But not all. Most of them fall off, but some retain, and that's how we can be sure we're looking at a beech tree. Did you know maple trees have to be a certain size before they're ready to be tapped for maple sap? Let me tell you a little bit more about it. Maple trees have to be about 40 years old before they're ready to be tapped. But how do we know when a tree is 40 years old? It's easy to tell the age of a tree if it's been cut down like this one. Have you ever seen something like this? Maybe you can see an example with your class and count the rings on a tree. This is how we tell the age of a tree. You count each of the spaces between the rings, and each one of those counts for a year. This tree happens to be about 40 years old. It's not a maple because we're keeping the maple trees to produce sap. But we can see the spaces in some spots are larger and thinner in others. Why do you think that is? I'm going to tell you. That's because the spaces that are thicker, usually that means that it's a summer with a lot of rain. So the tree grows very well and it grows larger. Up here we see the spaces are a little bit thinner. What do you think that means? That's because maybe the summer was drier. There wasn't as much rain. We all know plants need rain and sunlight to grow. So that's how we can tell the age of a tree. A maple tree needs to be 40 years, like we said, or about the size of a small dinner plate. Do you guys think that that looks like the size of a small dinner plate? I think so. So this tree, if it were a maple tree and it were not cut, it would be ready to be tapped.
Pipeline in French is tuyau.
Hey, want to hear something really cool? Did you know trees have belly buttons? It's true. Maple trees often have belly buttons. What is a belly button and why does a tree have a belly button? I'm going to tell you. Maple trees, after they're tapped from the year before and the year before that, leaves a hole where the tap in the maple tree was. And just like us on our skin, if we fall and we skin our knee or our elbow, what does our skin do? Our skin repairs itself. There's a scab that forms and then it goes away, but we can still see that there was an injury there. There was something that was hurt. So just like us, trees do the same thing. So on this tree, I can see two belly buttons. Can you guys see them? Let's look closely. Here is one. So that was probably from last year when we tapped this tree for sap. And there's another one on this side. Can you guys spot it? I can. Who would have thought that a tree would have belly buttons? If we look up here, this is where we've tapped this tree this year to collect sap in the pipeline. That means that next year, this tree will have another belly button right here. Pretty cool.
Belly button in French is nombril.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us today on this virtual field trip. We really hope that you learned something along the way and that you had a good time. We really liked showing you around. We hope that you can come out and join us right here in the forest really soon. Now that you and your class know how to identify a maple tree, we challenge you, next time you're out in the schoolyard, in your backyard, or even out in your neighborhood, try and see if you can find a maple tree. Don't forget to look for the opposite branching